imputed genotypes. In 2013, the Icelandic DPA issued a decision in a case regarding an application from DCODE, the National University Hospital in Iceland, and a number of physicians for a permission to process personal data for research purposes. The research was to be aimed at preparing the use of genetic data retrieved from DNA sequencing in providing individual-based health services in the National University Hospital. According to the application, data on all those who received services from the hospital in the last 5 years was to be transmitted to DCODE and linked with its research data, including genotype data. Those data consisted, on the one hand, of genotypes of nearly 100,000 individuals who had consented to participating in the company's research project and given a biosample. But on the other hand, genotypes had been calculated or imputed for 80,000 relatives of those people. So in the light of the extent of the processing, the nature of the data in question, the lack of consent of the majority of the data subjects to the processing of genetic data, as well as the lack of legal provisions allowing for the processing, the conclusion of the DPA was to reject the application. Furthermore, the DPA instructed DCODE to ensure that all processing of imputed genotypes linked to certain individuals, including retention, would be based on the consent of those individuals. Following the decision, DCODE deleted all registers with imputed genotypes. However, DCODE did as well propose a method of imputing genotypes without, albeit, retaining them. According to the proposal, imputed genotypes would only exist in a split second when linking genealogical data with genetic and health data, aiming at obtaining statistical results on genetic factors. Those imputed genotypes would neither be stored in any way nor be accessible to anyone. The Icelandic DPA accepted this proposal with strict conditions. Now, in 2014, an act of law was passed on scientific research in Iceland in the health sector. The act establishes an administrative system with a one-stop shop. Those who wish to conduct health-related research in Iceland send an application to the National Bioethics Committee, or in some cases bioethics committees within National University or the National University Hospital and the hospital in the largest town in north of Iceland, Akureyri. The application is then sent to the DPA for reviewing the processing of personal data. The DPA has 10 workdays to finish its review and can, if it deems necessary, decide to look further into the matter and prolong this time period. Furthermore, the DPA can impose conditions on the processing, including to the security of personal data. And when the DPA has finished its review, the relevant ethics committees then decides on whether or not to issue a permit. And the decision of the DPA has always been followed there. Now, this one-stop shop is a big change from the procedures followed before the 2014 Act, when permits often had to be obtained from both bioethics committees and the DPA. Now, according to the Act, research projects are grouped into 2 categories: scientific research on human subjects involving direct participation of individuals on the one hand, and retrospective studies, only based on already documented health data on the other. Consent must always be obtained from participants in research on human subjects. However, the Act does not stipulate a condition of consent in retrospective studies. Now, the Act allows for a retention of personal data obtained in retrospective studies indefinitely. The data must then be kept in a so-called health data bank, provisions on which are to be found in a special act on both health data banks and biobanks. As stipulated in the Act, data banks and biobanks may not be established unless permitted by the Minister of Health, after having received opinions from the National Directory of Health, the National Bioethics Committee, and the DPA. Furthermore, the Act contains a number of conditions for the retention of data and biosamples, including that data and samples kept for scientific purposes shall be stored without personal identification markers, that is, only with research codes or number. And a key allowing for the linking with the identification marker shall be in accordance with rules passed by the DPA. Now, no health data bank has been established as of yet in Iceland. The provisions on such data banks were added in 2014 to the already existing 2000 Act on biobanks. And in an opinion covering parliamentary bills on both the revision of the Act and the proposed Act on scientific research in the health sector, it must be mentioned and stressed that the DPA expressed doubts as to whether the indefinite retention of health data obtained for research purposes was compatible with the constitutional rights to privacy, citing the aforementioned 2003 Supreme Court judgment on the Act on the Health Sector Database. Now, as already mentioned, the DPA can impose conditions on the processing of personal data for health-related research, and this has been done with regard to research conducted by DCODE in Iceland. The conditions which were imposed in 2015 and renewed in 2017 are general and imply as such to all research projects undertaken by DCODE according to permits from the National Bioethics Committee. The conditions contain provisions on, amongst other things, a body called the Research Service Centre, a private foundation which, after a permit has been given to DCODE, receives health data from health institutions and health professionals for the purpose of contacting patients, asking for their consent to participation, extracting their biosamples and collecting their answers to health-related questionnaires. Now, the Service Centre receives data for retrospective studies as well, collected without consent. Furthermore, the Centre transmits data collected both for studies on human subjects and retrospective studies to DCODE through an encryption system which encodes personal identification markers. Under no circumstances may identification markers be accessible by DCODE or its staff.